this week's PARSHA, we read about the conclusion of the Eser Makas, and of course the final Makkah, which is the Makas Bechoros, the killing of the firstborn. And in the warning that Moshe Rabbeinu gave Paro, he told him, Kayamar Hashem, so said Hashem, Kachatzos halayla, and the Yotzei b'sof Mitzrayim, at midnight I will go out in the midst of Mitzrayim, Umeis kol b'char, the Eretz Mitzrayim, all the firstborn will die. V'haisat tza'aka gedoyla b'chal Eretz Mitzrayim, there will be a great cry in the entire land. And Hashem adds, U'l'chol b'nei Yisrael lo yechratz kelev l'shono, that no dog will sharpen its tongue to a Jew. And the Rishonim bring a Gemara Bavakama. The Gemara Bavakama says, Klav m'tzeakim be'ir, when dogs bark in a city, that's a sign that the Malach HaMavos has come. Somehow, the barking of dogs is associated with death. So here, the Egyptians will die, and the Jews will not only be spared from death, but even from the barking of the dogs. And the pasuk continues, and this is Laman Teidun, this is that you should know, Asher Yafla Hashem bein Mitzrayim uvein Yisrael, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu divides, he separates between Mitzrayim and Yisrael. So the purpose of the Makas Bechoros, Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to tell Paro, is that it should be clear that HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes a division, makes a distinction between Mitzrayim and Yisrael. The Mitzrayim is going to suffer the Makas Bechoros, and the Jews will be spared. And the obvious question is that until now this wasn't obvious. According to Chazal, all the earlier Makas, the Jews also were spared. So why all of a sudden do we have the Torah telling us that with the Makas Bechoros it will be apparent that there's a division, a separation between Mitzrayim and Yisrael, as if this wasn't apparent until now. Again, according to Chazal, the Jews were spared from all the Makas. Now, the truth is, this point is really a machlekes rishonim. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, in the 5th parak, that Eser Nisim Nasu Lavesein Lib Mitzrayim. There were 10 miracles that were performed for our forefathers in Egypt. Later in that Mishnah, it says there were Eser Makas, 10 plagues, that struck the Egyptians. So what are the 10 plagues? That we know. What are the 10 miracles that happened to our forefathers? So the Rishonim learn the 10 miracles were that the Jews were spared from the 10 Makas. Those are the 10 miracles. And the Rambam in the Pirusha Mishnah goes through all the psukim of the 10 Makas, and he shows that it's clear in 9 of the 10 that the Jews weren't afflicted. The only Makkah where it isn't explicit, says the Rambam, is the Makkah of Kinim. And there he says we have a Kabbalah that the Makkah of Kinim was not an exception. But in the case of the other 9, says the Rambam, it's explicit that only Mitzrayim suffered and not the Jews. And the Rambam goes through the Psukim, because in each of the 9 Makkahs, other than Kinim, it says explicitly that the Makkah only will affect Mitzrayim, and that implies not Israel. But the truth is that Ibn Ezra argues on this point. Ibn Ezra, in last week's Parsha, by the Makkah of Dam, disagrees. And he says a very surprising thing. He says that many of the Makkahs, the Jews suffered as well. And he's commenting on a very well-known Medrash. The Medrash says that in the case of the Makkah of Dam, that a Jew and an Egyptian could pour water from the same pitcher, and for the Egyptian it was blood, and for the Jew it was water. So he brings this Medrash, and he asks a question. Rabbi Meimrim, many say that the water in the hands of the Egyptians was red like blood, V'nislabnu biyad ha'Yisraeli. In the hands of the Jew, they became clear. But if so, lam v'lo nichtav oz zeh b'Torah. Why is this sign not written in the Torah? L'fi daiti, it seems to me, ki makas hadam v'atzvardim v'hakinim ha'yisal kaileles ha'mitzvim v'ha'ivrim. That the first three plagues, Dam, Tzfardeya, and Kinim, affected the Jews and the Egyptians equally, says Ibn Ezra. Ki achar ha'kosav nirdaif, because we follow the simple reading of the Psukim. We don't follow the Midrashim, we follow the simple reading of the Psukim, and in those three makas, there is no explicit statement that the Jews are separate. Now, the Rambam had said that at least in the case of Dam and Sfardeya, it is explicit. So is it explicit or is it not explicit? So the question really is that how explicit must it be? The Rambam understands that wherever it says in the Pasuk that the Makkah struck Mitzrayim, we can take that to mean Mitzrayim and not Israel. It doesn't have to say explicitly that the Jews were excluded. If it says the Makkah struck Mitzrayim, then we can take that to mean Mitzrayim and not Israel. If we're according to the Rambam, by the Makkah of Dam and Sfardeya, it is explicit that Israel was excluded because it says Mitzrayim suffered. So Mitzrayim implies Mitzrayim and not Israel. Kinim is an exception, because by Kinim it says Vatiyah Kinam ba'adam v'bahema, that the Kinim struck man and animal. There it doesn't say the word Mitzrayim. Therefore the Rambam says that one is not clear, but we have a Kabbalah that also is no different than the other Makkahs. But the Ibn Ezra says differently. The Ibn Ezra says that we assume that the Makkah struck across the board unless there's an explicit statement that Yisrael was excluded. And the first time we have that is by the Makkah of Arayv. Because by the Makkah of Arayv, in the warning that Hashem told Moshe to give to Paro, it says, "V'yitzleisi bayomahu eseretz Goshen asher ami omed oleha." I will separate on that day the land of Goshen, on which my people live. Levilti heyoshim arov. There should be no arov there. And in the case of the Makkah of the Dever, the next plague, it also is explicit. It says, "V'hitla Hashem be'miknei Yisrael be'miknei Mitzrayim." Hashem will separate between the livestock of the Jews and the livestock of the Egyptians. V'lo yamus mikol b'nei Yisrael dover. And no animal belonging to a Jew will die. So the Ibn Ezra says it's only in the case of the Arayv and the Dever we have an explicit exclusion. But the first three Makkahs, Dan, Tzvardeya, and Kinim, affected the Jews and the Egyptians equally. So the question is, what's the difference? Because why were the first three shared with the Egyptians? And why was Arayv separate? So he says, Ve'ela hasholash ma'at hiziku. Because these first three were not so destructive. They were unpleasant, they were inconvenient, but they weren't that destructive. And therefore, the Jews got them too. Rak makas ha'arayv shayis hakasha. But Arayv, which was a very difficult makkah, so Hashem hifrish bein ha'mitzvim bein ha'Yisrael. There HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the distinction. V'kacha makas ha'dever. And so in the case of the makkah of Dever, also it's a very destructive makkah, so there too there was a distinction. Now, the makkah after Dever is Shchin. Boils. Boils are not that destructive, they're painful, but not destructive. And there the Ibn Ezra says as well, that the Jews were afflicted by the Shchin. The next makkah was Barad. There the Pasuk says there was no Barad in Eretz Goshen. So the Ibn Ezra says again that Barad is just like Arayv and Dever, very destructive. And therefore the Jews were spared. So v'kacha makas hadever v'abarad v'avur miknehem. So that's why they were spared from those makas. Lo came b'shchin. But not so in the case of Shchin. In the case of Shchin, the Jews also suffered. V'lo ba'arba, and as well, in the case of the arba, the locusts, also the Jews suffered. Even though l'chara the arba was very destructive. But the Ibn Ezra says there's a very big difference. That the arba destroyed plants. And that was going to be irrelevant to the Jews because the Jews were on their way out. Barad and Dever attacked their livestock. The livestock the Jews were going to take with them when they left Mitzrayim. So therefore that was a big loss. But the loss of their farms and trees and plants, that really was irrelevant. The Jews were leaving anyway. And therefore the Jews suffered the Arba. And the Ibn Ezra doesn't go on to explain, but the Choshech also differentiated. That was explicit. But there were special considerations, as Rashi says, because the whole purpose of the Choshech was so that the Jews should be able to bury their fellows who died in the Yemei HaChoshech. So therefore, and the Egyptians shouldn't see, so for the Egyptians it was dark, for the Jews it was light. So there was a special cheshbon there. But putting that aside, the Ibn Ezra basically says that when it came to the Makkah of Dom, Sfardeya, Kinim, Shchin, and Arba, the Jews also suffered, and the Jews were only spared from the Makkahs of Arayv, Dever, Barad, and Choshech. That's the sheet of the Ibn Ezra. Now the Tur, in his Peirush on Chumash, asks a question on the Ibn Ezra. He says, it doesn't make any sense. He says, how is it possible that the Jews suffered the Makkahs? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu certainly has the power to pinpoint the Makkah, to afflict the person he wants to afflict, and to spare the person he wants to spare. Now, it almost seems that the Tur understood that what the Ibn Ezra was saying is that really HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to direct the Makkahs at the Egyptians, but there was collateral damage. You know, when you drop a bomb, so sometimes even if you aim the bomb at a military target, you may injure civilians in the process. So we have a euphemism, collateral damage, for that. So as well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to send the Makkahs only to the Egyptians, but there was collateral damage in some of the cases. So the Torah asks, that's not shayach, that's not applicable to the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Rebbeinu Shalom can pinpoint the Makkah. If he wants to send the Makkah to the Egyptians to spare the Jews, he certainly can do that. Because you could have people dying here and 1 inch later, 1 inch away, not dying. So how can we understand that the Jews should have suffered any of the Makkahs? That's the kasha that the Torah asks. Others ask a different kasha. But how is it possible for the Ibn Ezra to argue on Chazal? But if Chazal say that the Jews were spared from the Makkah of Dam, and the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says explicitly that the Jews were spared from all the plagues, these are the Asar and Nisim, how is it possible that the Ibn Ezra could have a shita which was connected with Chazal? This is a very, very basic hashkafa question. And we find this in many Rishonim, and often in the Ramban. The Ramban will bring how Chazal learned Pshat in Psukim, and then the Ramban will say, Al Derech HaPshat, that it seems that the Psukim have a different meaning. So what is the Ramban coming to do? He's coming to argue on Chazal? Chazal learned this way, but I say that they're wrong. I mean, what is the Ramban doing when he says that? Now we know, of course, Chazal tell us Shivim Panim L'Torah. There are 70 faces to the Torah. And the Gemara says, the Mikra Echad Yotzev L'Kama Tainim. A single pasuk can have many, many interpretations. So often, it's not a problem. Where the two interpretations, or the many interpretations, are complementary, they all can be true. So then we can say that the Chazal gave one interpretation, and the Rishonim gave a different interpretation, and the Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. But where it becomes difficult is we're dealing with a historical fact. L'maisa, did the Jews suffer in some of the Makkahs, or did they not suffer in some of the Makkahs? If Chazal say they didn't, and Ibn Ezra says they did, here you're going to have a very hard time saying Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. Both are true. Did they or didn't they? They can't both be true. So that's a serious question. So there's a Peirush which is printed in every standard edition of the Mikoros Gedolos. It's a Peirush from Ibn Ezra, which is called the Eliezer, who says that this little piece of Ibn Ezra must have been the insertion of a Talmud Taya, a mistaken student. Now, it's not shayach that Ibn Ezra could have said such a thing. He couldn't have gone contrary to Chazal. So it must be a Talmud Taya. The question is, who would have tampered with the manuscript of the Ibn Ezra to insert his own chidushim? I was going to point out, it's very different than we think. If I had a manuscript today of the Ibn Ezra, and I was publishing it, I wouldn't put in my own chidushim in that manuscript. I wouldn't tamper with the manuscripts of Gadol Yisrael who lived 1,000 years ago. But at the time, when his manuscripts were being spread among contemporaries, people took such liberties. In other words, if I would give a shiur, let's say, and someone wanted to see notes from the shiur, and he was copying the notes, so he might put in his own ha'aras, his own observations in the transcript of the shiur, because he's not tampering with something which is of venerable heritage. So likewise, that's how mistakes could have crept into the Ibn Ezra's manuscript. Because at the time that Ibn Ezra was writing and people were copying, so people might have put in their own thoughts, and that's how it got in here. But it certainly says that Avi Ezer was a Talmud Tayyib. Now I would like to offer a conjecture that would explain how the Ibn Ezra is not a stira to Chazal. That we could say Elu Elokim Chayim, both are true, even in this context. The issue is really like this. We know that among the Jews, there were two categories of Jews. There were the Jews that were faithful and wanted to be liberated and were willing to follow Moshe Rabbeinu into the Midbar to serve the Ribbon Shloim. And there were those Jews who wanted to stay. Chazal tell us that in the Gimel Yemei Chayshech, those Jews died. Rashi says in this week's Parsha that those Jews died because they were Rishoyim Shlo Ratzu Lotzeis. They didn't want to leave Mitzrayim. That's Rashi's Loshen. These were Rishoyim that didn't want to leave Mitzrayim. They were happy in Mitzrayim. They were fairly assimilated. They didn't want to leave. So those Jews died during the Gimel Yemei Chayshech. So Klal Yisrael was divided into two factions. I would offer the conjecture like this. Let's say there's a Gezeira. Hashem sends a Gezeira against Mitzrayim. Will it afflict Jews? It'll depend. The Jews who see themselves as part of Mitzrayim will be included in the Gezeira against Mitzrayim. The Jews who see themselves as Jews, not as Egyptians, will not be included in the Gezeira. So it's possible that yesh v'yesh. There were some Jews that were included in the Gezeira. Why? Because they saw themselves as Egyptians. And there were other Jews who were not included in the Gezeira because they saw themselves not as Egyptians. Just to bring a support to such an idea, there's a Maral in the Sefer Nesivos Olam that is commenting on a very well-known Gemara, in Brachas. The Gemara in Brachas says that Rabbi Akiva once came to a city. He wanted to lodge in that city, and he had with him a candle and a rooster and a donkey, and no one gave him a place to lodge in the city, so he had to sleep in the field. And then a wind came, blew out the candle, and a cat came and ate the rooster, and a lion came and ate the donkey, and he's all alone. And then that night, a regiment of Roman soldiers came and occupied the city, took everybody captive, and Rabbi Akiva realized that he was miraculously spared, because if he had the candle and he had the rooster and the donkey which would make noise, he would have been caught. They would have found him too, and therefore he was spared. And called over Rachman Latavavid. You see that everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu does is for the best, even though at the time he thought it was a disaster. Really, this was how he was spared. So the Maral on that Gemara says an amazing pshat. He says like this. He says that on that city there was a Gezeira, there was a decree that everybody in that city should be taken captive, enslaved, killed, whatever. Now every human being is comprised of three parts. He has a body, it's his guf. He has his nefesh, which is his life force, like even animals have. And then he has his uniquely human intellect, the seichel. Every person is comprised of three things. If there's a gezeira on the person to be enslaved or to be killed, that gezeira is on all three parts of his being, on his body, and on his life force, and on his intellect. Says the Maral, Rabbi Akiva wanted to join that city. He wanted to be a part of that city. And to the extent he wanted to be a part of that city, he would have been included in the Gezeira against that city. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu had Rachmanos on him. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that instead of taking away his body and his life force and his intellect, I will take away something which is symbolic of each of those three. So the Maral says that the donkey, the chamor means chaymer, material, that corresponds to the body. The candle corresponds to the nefesh, to the life force. As the pasuk says, Ner Elokim Nishmas Adam, the soul of man is God's candle. And the rooster corresponds to the intellect, as we say every morning in our davening, Asher Nasan Lasech Vina. So Rabbi Akiva also should have lost his body and his life force and his intellect. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu had Rachmanos, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had mercy, and instead of taking away his body, took away his donkey. Instead of taking away his life force, took away his candle. Instead of taking away his intellect, took away his rooster. It's an amazing pshat in the Gemara. But this much he says, that why was Rabbi Akiva Bechlal the Gzeira? Why was he included in the Gzeira against that city? He wasn't in that city. But he wanted to be in that city. He wanted to be a part of that city. You want to be a part of something? You're included in the Gzeira. Just mention an interesting thing about Lot. That Lot, it seems from the Psukim, it wasn't an easy thing to save Lot from stone. It required the schus of Avraham Avinu. And at first glance, it's an amazing thing, because Chazal say, Rashi learns the PARSHA, if there would have been 10 people like Lot, the entire city would have been spared. So apparently Lot was a tzaddik of the Madrega, that he could have spared the city, had there been enough of him, had there been 10 of him, 10 clones of Lot. And yet to save Lot, it required the schus of Avraham Avinu. And the answer is this: if there would have been 10 people like Lot, the city would have been spared. There would have been no gzeira on the city. But there weren't 10, so there was a gzeira in the city. And Lot wanted to be a part of that city. So if you want to be a part of the city, you're b'chlal the gzeira. So therefore there had to be special considerations, the merit of Avraham Avinu, to spare Lot. But if not for that, Lot would have been b'chlal the gzeira, not because he was as wicked as them, but because he wanted to be a part of that city. So if you want to be a part of something, you're b'chlal the gzeira. So therefore our conjecture is that it depends. There were some Jews, the faithful Jews, the Jews who ultimately were redeemed, they were spared from the Makkos. That's PARSHA. And that's what Chazal are referring to when they say Asar Nisim Nasal Yisrael, when they say that for the Jews the water was clear, for the Yeshivas was blood. It's referring to those good Jews, those faithful Jews. It says, but the Jews that weren't so that wanted to be part of Mitzrayim, they were b'chlal the gzeira of Mitzrayim. Except, Ibn Ezra says, for the most severe makas, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had Rachmanos even on them. So therefore they were spared from the Arayv, and from the Dever, and from the Barad, and the Chayshech, there were special considerations, as we said. But, and those are the ones that died in the Chayshech, by the way. But the point is that we could say that Ibn Ezra is not a stira to Chazal. But there's a more serious question, which I didn't see any of the Mefarshim ask, but we can ask, which is, okay, we've answered the contradiction from Chazal. We've also answered the Torah's question. The Torah's question is that it can't just be that the Jews suffered collateral damage. And the answer is no. The Jews that suffered were Jews that deserved to suffer because they were part of the Egyptian people. They made themselves Egyptians. But the question is this: the purpose of the Makkos, is clear from the Chumash, is to communicate a message to Paro. That was the purpose of the Makkos, that Paro should understand something. So if Paro is shown Makkos wherein Jews are spared and Egyptians are afflicted, so Paro will get the message that obviously Mitzrayim is doing something wrong. We have to do tshuva, we have to repent, we have to release the Jews, whatever. But what kind of message is Paro going to learn if he witnesses a Makkah where Jews and Egyptians suffer together? I mean, if anything, it would seem that such a Makkah would be sending the exact wrong message to Paro. Because Paro would say to himself, listen, this can't prove that I have to do something for the Jews if the Jews are suffering in the Makkah as well. But think about it for a second. Let's say the Makkah of Dan. If there were Jews who suffered, like, isn't this a kasha Right? What lesson should Paro learn from this makkah? What am I supposed to do? This is a message to me, to my people, that we should do tshuva, we should repent, we should do the right thing. There are Jews suffering too. Because it would seem that, forget the question whether there were Jews deserving, but in terms of the message that the makkah comes to communicate, it only makes sense if the makkah is an exclusively Egyptian makkah. If there are Jews that are going to suffer in the makkah, so what message is Paro supposed to expect from this? It happens to be that the Ibn Ezra in this whole mahalach is l'shitaso. The Ibn Ezra follows an opinion he expresses back in PARSHA Shemos. There's a machlekes Ramban on the Ibn Ezra, and the Ibn Ezra is l'shitaso. It's an amazing pasuk. The first time Moshe Rabbeinu comes to Paro, and we talked about this pasuk 2 weeks ago, he comes to Paro and he presents his case, and we analyzed the psukim very, very carefully 2 weeks ago. But he says like this. He says, Vayomu, and Moshe and Aaron said to Paro, Elokei ha'ivrim nikru aleinu, the God of the Hebrews revealed himself to us. Therefore, ne'elcha na derech shlosha yomim b'midbar, let us travel 3 days in the midbar, v'nizbuch al Hashem Elokeinu, and bring karbonos, pen yifgo'enu ba'dever o be'charev, lest we be afflicted by pestilence or sword. Now this is something new. HaKadosh Baruch Hu never told this to Moshe at the sneh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe, go to Paro and tell Paro that you have to go and bring karbonos. But Moshe adds over here, we have to bring karbonos lest we be afflicted by pestilence or the sword. Where did Moshe get this from? What does it mean? Rashi says that really this was just a nice way of speaking. When you speak to a king, you have to have derech eretz. You have to have kavod malchus. You have to have honor for the king. Really, what he was telling Paro is, we have to bring karbonos, or else you're going to suffer pestilence of the sword. Because you're going to suffer makas. You don't let us go, you're going to suffer makas. But you don't speak to a king that way. So you use a euphemism. So you say, you got to let us go, or else we're going to suffer makas. But essentially, Rashi learns that this was the threat of the makas. And the makas were referred to back at the sneh. And Moshe told Paro, listen, says Hashem revealed himself to us, he wants us to bring karbonos, and we have to bring karbonos, or else you are going to suffer makas. That's what Rashi says. The Ramban says, al derech ha'emes, al pi Kabbalah, you could learn the pasuk kipshuto, that if we don't bring karbonos, we're going to suffer makas. We'll suffer plagues. Why? So says the Ramban, because here Moshe Rabbeinu was revealing to Paro the side of karbonos, the mystery, the secret of karbonos. What are the purpose? Why do we bring karbonos? The purpose of karbonos is to avert suffering, to avert disaster. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us to bring karbonos, it's understood that the reason we have to bring karbonos is because we are liable, we are susceptible to suffering some type of disaster. As a punishment for our averis, we need a kapara. So therefore, you can learn the pasuk if you embrace derech ha'emes, you embrace the Kabbalistic interpretation of karbonos, you could learn that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was really saying. That Hashem told us to bring karbonos, of course that means that we are at risk of dever or cherev. This is the Ramban's interpretation of derech ha'emes. But the Ibn Ezra has a different shot there. The Ibn Ezra says that yifgo'enu means we will suffer, meaning the Jews and Mitzrayim together will suffer. That's the Ibn Ezra's shot. That he was telling Paro, listen, you have to let us go and bring karbonos, or else we're all going to suffer. Why are we all going to suffer? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants his karbonos. If he doesn't get his karbonos, who knows what can happen? So it's not only that you will suffer, we will also suffer. We'll all suffer. We're all in the same boat together. That's what the Ibn Ezra says. The Ramban argues in the Ibn Ezra there, because the Ramban says, where did Moshe invent this from? Because where did Moshe get this idea that if we would not bring karbonos, everyone would suffer? He invented it? Like he invented it on his own? Certainly. A shliach from the Ribono Shel Olam was make up his own ideas. That's the Ramban's kasha. But this is how the Ibn Ezra learns. The Ibn Ezra says that what Moshe was telling Paro is, we have to bring karbonos. If we don't bring karbonos, we're all going to suffer. We're going to suffer and you're going to suffer. We're all going to suffer. And therefore it's in your interest to let us go and bring karbonos. The Ibn Ezra, referring back to this earlier comment, later speaks out that, in fact, that's why later in the Makkos, after Paro experiences the Makkah of Oraiv, he calls Moshe and Aaron and says, go bring your karbonos, but here in Mitzrayim. So, like out of nowhere, Paro got this idea of bringing karbonos. In other words, after the fourth Makkah, Paro realized what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying was true. It was nizbarer to Paro that what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying is true, and therefore Paro says, yeah, we have to bring karbonos. The only question is the terms, the details. So Paro says, bring them only in Eretz Mitzrayim. Moshe says, no. Then Paro says, okay, don't go so far. And he says, only go the men and leave the bulk of your livestock behind. And through the Parsha, Paro is fetching on the details. But the idea of bringing karbonos, Paro understands. It comes out like this. It comes out that the Ibn Ezra has a whole different understanding of the entire Parsha of Va'era and Bo than we have. In other words, let's say we were in Paro's shoes. So okay, Paro, his heart is hardened. He doesn't learn the lessons he's meant to learn from the Makkos. But what lesson was he meant to learn? If Hashem wouldn't have hardened his heart, what lesson should he have learned? What would the tshuva of Paro have been? What should Paro have done, and why should he have done it? So we always learn the Parsha this way. We always learn that the taina on Paro is Paro enslaved the Jewish people, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a superior claim. You can't enslave the Jews to the extent that they aren't free to discharge their obligations to the Ribono Shel Olam. As Rashi says in the pasuk that Ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim, the Jews are my slaves that I took out of Mitzrayim, that they should be my slaves. So Rashi uses the lashon shtori kaidam. My star, my deed, my claim comes first. Meaning, you want to enslave the Jews, you can enslave the Jews, but you can't enslave the Jews to the extent that they can't discharge their earlier obligations, more fundamental obligations, to the Ribono Shel Olam. The Ribono Shel Olam is our first master. First, you have to discharge your duty to him. You have any left over time, then you can serve another master. So the idea, we always learn the Parsha, is this what the message of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was saying? When HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I want them to bring karbonos from the midbar. They should travel 3 days, bring karbonos, Paro's unlet. The taina on Paro is that Paro is asserting his ownership over the Jews. I am your master. You'll do what I say. You'll go where I tell you to go. Otherwise, you'll stay put. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the grievance. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, listen, you're their master. But your ownership cannot impose itself on the Bnei Yisrael to the extent that they can't discharge their obligations to me. Shtori kaidem, my star comes first. First they have to do what I told them to do. And after that they can work for you. So if I'm demanding that they take a 3-day vacation and bring karbonos in the midbar, so that's the way it's going to be. After that they can come back and work for you again. But my star is superior. My obligation supersedes the obligations they have to you. That's how we always learn the parsha. The Ibn Ezra is learning differently. The Ibn Ezra is learning that the issue is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants korbanos. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants everyone to be humbled before him. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I want korbanos from the Jewish people, Paro better make sure that that happens. Why? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu insists on korbanos. I have to be served. So the Jews will do the actual bringing of the korbanos, but Paro had better make sure that it happens. It's not a question of Paro's enslavement of the Jews. It's a question that Paro has an obligation to serve the Ribono Shel Olam just like the Jews have an obligation to serve the Ribono Shel Olam. And therefore, just like the Jews have to bring korbanos, Paro has to make sure the Jews bring korbanos. And if Paro does not facilitate the Jews bringing korbanos, Paro and the Jews are going to suffer. Why? For not bringing korbanos. In other words, if the suffering of Paro is because of his enslavement of the Jews, he is over-enslaving them. He is enslaving them to the extent that they can't fulfill their obligations to the Ribono Shel Olam, then the Avla is totally Paro's. The Jews are totally innocent. It would make no sense to direct a Makkah against Jews as well. The Makkah can only be directed against Mitzrayim, and that's the sheet of most of the Rishonim against the Ibn Ezra. It makes no sense that the Jews should suffer a Makkah. What did the Jews do wrong? They did absolutely nothing wrong. If the Avla, if the Chet of Mitzrayim is the enslavement of the Jews being taken too far, that's a Chet which only Mitzrayim committed. The Jews are totally innocent of that. The Jews are the victims, they are not the sinners. And therefore it would make no sense that there should be a Makkah which afflicts the Jews as well. But the Ibn Ezra learned the parsha differently. He learned the parsha that the avla over here is korbanos, Hashem says. I need korbanos. You have to bring korbanos. That's what Hashem is saying for. You have to, I demand to be worshipped. So the Jews have to do the worshiping and Paro has to do the facilitating, and if it isn't done, everyone is going to suffer. That's pen yifkoen. We have to bring korbanos because otherwise we're all going to suffer. We're going to suffer for not bringing the korbanos as Moshe, and you're going to suffer for not facilitating our bringing the korbanos. So therefore, when you have makkahs and even the Jews suffer, Paro gets the message. That is exactly what is going on. It makes perfect sense that there should be makkahs that the Jews suffer. But it comes out that according to the Ibn Ezra, the Jews and the Egyptians are really in the same boat. In other words, until the very end, it's not the idea that it's God and the Jews against the Egyptians. It's God against the Egyptians and the Jews. In other words, Paro was in a situation where he's told, you have to facilitate our bringing korbanos, because otherwise God is going to be angry at both of us. So the sides are arrayed differently according to Ibn Ezra than according to the other Rishonim. According to the other Rishonim, it's God on the Jews' side against Paro. And therefore Paro suffers the makkahs and the Jews are spared. According to Ibn Ezra, it's God against Paro and the Jews. In other words, God is saying, I want korbanos, I demand korbanos. The Jews better bring korbanos, and the Egyptians better facilitate the korbanos, and if not, pen yifke'enu, everyone is going to suffer. And therefore, the makkah of Dam, everyone suffers, and the makkah of Tzfardei, everyone suffers, the makkah of Kinim, everyone suffers. Comes Arayv. Arayv is very, very destructive, the Jews are spared. So that's not a kasha. Because after all, in the not bringing korbanos, who is more guilty, Paro or the Jews? No, the Jews would have done it. Paro didn't let them. So obviously Paro was more guilty than the Jews. So that there could be a makkah which strikes Mitzrayim, and not the Jews, is not a pirach, is not a kasha. But a makkah that strikes everybody also isn't a kasha. Because the makkah is coming for not bringing korbanos. And if you look in the Ibn Ezra, he actually says this several times. in his parish. He says by the Makkah of Arav, he says that Paro realized, we're getting Makkahs for not bringing Karbonos. He doesn't say we're getting Makkahs for having enslaved the Jews. We're getting Makkahs for not bringing Karbonos. And when you think about it for a second, this is conjecture, but it's a funny way of reading the Parsha. When Paro suggests, okay, bring Karbonos, just don't go too far. Or bring Karbonos, don't take the children with you. Or bring Karbonos and leave your livestock as a guarantee that you'll come back. And the Jews say, no, we're not going. We're going to take everybody with us and all the animals with us. Right? How does Paro look at that? According to the Ibn Ezra, I think Paro looks at it very interestingly. In other words, at this point, Paro desperately wants to bring Karbonos. He understands that his whole nation's future is dependent on the Jews bringing Karbonos. And the Jews are being so abstinent, not bringing Karbonos. Says, go bring the Karbonos already. We need you to bring the Karbonos. It's not that Paro is relenting. It's okay, I give in, but only part way. Paro would be begging them, please go, bring Karbonos. We need Karbonos. You'll do a public service by bringing Karbonos. You'll save the country with Karbonos. They say, no, unless it's on our terms, we're not going. I mean, Paro could have had a very serious grievance in them. It's not just that they're not accepting his magnanimous offer. Right? They are endangering the entire Mitzrayim by not doing what they can do to save the country. If they bring the Karbonos, the crisis will be over. They're refusing to bring Karbonos because they want it to be on their terms. So they're destructive. Paro's anger, his mounting anger, is readily understood. But it comes out like this Mahalach, a very interesting thing, that until the very end, of course Paro knows that the Makkah of Arayv, there was a distinction, in the Makkah of Dever there was a distinction, in the Makkah of Bora there was a distinction, but it's not a fundamental distinction. It isn't that Yisrael and Mitzrayim are diametrically opposed. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is putting them together. They're all liable for not bringing Karbonos. Okay, maybe Mitzrayim is more liable because they're in control. The Jews, to a certain extent, they're constrained by circumstances beyond their control. So you can have some Makkahs that afflict everybody, the more serious Makkahs, only Mitzrayim, not the Jews. But there's no opposition. They're not on opposite sides. When is that revealed? That's revealed at the Makkahs B'chayros. At the Makkahs B'chayros, this is when Hashem reveals that it's not as you think, Paro. It's not that I need Karbonos. I need Karbonos. I need Karbonos like a hole in the head. I need Karbonos. Right? The point of this whole exercise is that the Jews are my people, and I'm going to liberate them, and you're going to be left behind and suffer. So that's the meaning of the Pasuk. The Pasuk says that the Makkahs B'chayros, that the Mitzrayim will die, and a dog won't bark at the Jews, L'man Taden, that you should know that Hashem will make a distinction between Yisrael and Mitzrayim. There's a distinction which is made with the Makkahs B'chayros which was not made. Because according to the Emperor's Mahalach, the fact that in some of the Makkahs there was a differentiation, right, doesn't mean that the Jews and the Egyptians are diametrically opposed. The whole Ibn Ezra's understanding is that there is a God who has demands of both, and there may be distinctions in terms of the level of responsibility, the level of culpability. And that's why the Jews suffer less than the Egyptians suffer. But essentially the demand he makes of both. Right? Now with the Makkahs B'chayros, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is revealing something new. The reality that, of course, we assumed all along, that it's not a question of Karbonos. It's not a question that Mitzrayim and Yisrael are in the same boat and Hashem has an equal demand of both of them. It says the Jews are his nation and they're going to be freed. And the Egyptians are the tormentors and they're going to be punished. And therefore it's with the Makkahs B'chayros alone that we have the real division between Yisrael and then Mitzrayim. The fact that in some of the Makkahs, or maybe even like the other Rishonim, all of the Makkahs, there was a division, could be understood differently. Yeah, there's a division because there are varying degrees of culpability, varying degrees of responsibility. So therefore there are practical differences. They suffered less, they suffered more. Those are differences, not essential differences. The essential difference, which is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is aligning himself with the Bnei Yisrael against Mitzrayim, that's only revealed in the Makkahs B'chayros.